thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. Unfortunately, Dean Watson is not able to attend, so I'll be moderating the discussion, which is mostly going to be an informal conversation with members of the research team from UH Energy and the Hobby School of Public Affairs that put together the UH Carbon Management Report. We're really interested in sharing our findings from that report and engaging a conversation about attitudes towards carbon management in the US and in Texas, and also discuss what are the opportunities for action along the possibilities of enacting policies and practices that would result in carbon neutrality in our consumption of energy through fuel and electricity. We have a great group of presenters, and we'll start with Yewande Olapade. Dr. Olapade is a postdoctoral fellow at the Hobby School of Public Affairs and many of the member of the research team, followed by Professor Francisco Cantu from the Department of Political Science and also an affiliate of the Hobby School and co-director of the Survey Research Institute. Professor Gail Buttorff, who co-directs the Survey Research Institute at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. Aparajita Datta, who's a MPP, it's like from the Hobby School of Public Affairs and a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston, and a member of UH Energy, who also was a member of the team. Professor Ramanan Krishnamoorti, Chief Energy Officer of the University of Houston. He directs the UH Energy and is Professor of Petroleum and Chemical Engineering. Let me start with Yewande. Could you tell us, briefly tell our audience about the results from the highlights from the report and what the take-home points might be?
Well, thank you, and it's my pleasure to be part of this conversation. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now so that you can view the results from the paper with me today. Okay. Okay. So today I will present some findings from the recently launched Carbon Management Survey. So due to the growing concern about the harm caused by greenhouse emissions stemming from the extraction, production, and use of fossil energy, as well as decarbonization, which has become a focus of government policy, the journey to clean energy policy has great implications on the future of the energy industry. Using low carbon technology that reduces pollution in the production of energy products means higher cost of production for oil and gas producer, as well as producer of energy products. And this could possibly raise the prices of energy products for households. And it also comes with some supply chains implication for prices of other products. So a strategic coordination and cooperation among all stakeholders, and by stakeholders I mean consumers, producers, and the government, is crucial to the success of a clean energy policy. A lower carbon future and securing access to sustainable energy requires the coordination of all these stakeholders. With that in mind, the UHNRD and the Hobby School of Public Affairs conducted a survey to measure public opinion and attitude towards climate change, support for carbon mitigation policies, and technologies for decarbonization. And lastly, our survey seeks to measure consumers' willingness to pay for energy products produced using low carbon technology. The online survey was launched in October 2020. The survey included responses from 1,000 individuals age 18 and above, residing in all 50 US states, including the District of Columbia. We also oversampled 500 residents of the state of Texas for a total sample of 1,500 respondents. A detailed report with distribution of responses to all questions is available on the UH Energy and the Orbis School of Public Affairs websites. So the first results from the survey that I'm going to share with you today is based on the level of opinion about climate change. So we asked respondents if they believe climate change is happening and if it is caused by human activity. So public opinion has historically played a critical role in shaping the US response on many policy fronts. The public knowledge, risk perception, attitudes, and behavior can help advance understanding of the policy appetites and preferences of Americans at a time when climate change mitigation and the energy transition are gaining global attention. So our survey shows that Texas respondents have similar level of awareness and opinions with the rest of the country. More than 80% acknowledge that climate change is happening, and about 75% believe it is anthropogenic. So the next result I'm going to show you from our survey is based on the question that we asked respondents on how they perceive the harm from climate change. Although about 4 out of 5 respondents urged the oil and gas industry and governments of developed countries to be responsible for greenhouse emissions, few blamed individual consumption preferences as being responsible for pollution, which is quite surprising. Respondents view harm from climate change to be a distant threat. As you can see from the figure, 19% Texans and 16% of respondents from other states view harm to serve as a great deal. And if you look to the figure to your right, you will see that more than 47% of respondents from both Texas and other states see climate change as a great deal of threat to future generations. This shows that respondents are more concerned about future generations experiencing harm from climate change as compared to themselves. So the next result I'm going to show you from the survey is based on the support. We try to measure the level of support for decarbonization. And talking about support for clean energy policy, we asked respondents whether they strongly agree or disagree that government should promote, incentivize, and subsidize carbon management. So the figure to your left reports the responses from all respondents, and to the right, we have responses, we plot the same distribution by age group. 22% Texans and 23% of respondents from other states somewhat agree and support decarbonization. 36% respondents from Texas strongly agree that government should do something about carbon management, while 32% from respondents from other states some strongly agree that government should do something about carbon management. And when we plot the distribution by age, we see a similar pattern whereby people from respondents from all ages somewhat agree and strongly agree that government should do something about carbon management. So there's a broad, strong support for decarbonization across the US states and across all ages. So I'm going to stop right here and allow my colleagues to talk more about this survey. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yewande. I'm going to yield the time to Francisco now, Professor Cantu. Could you tell us what the public perceives as being the major threats that result from global warming? Do you have, it's like, what's the evidence that we find?
Yes, I mean, I guess the most important result from that section of the survey is like what people perceive as the extreme events that will come with global warming. I guess like 2/3 of the sample thought that it has to do with fires, hurricanes, or droughts, right? So it's like 2/3, and it seems like it's the most popular answer. And then on the other extreme, only like 44% of the people think that global warming will bring increased migration and displacement of people. So we can see this range of about 20 points, right, of all these different events. I guess this can be like either an opportunity to focus on what issues or events may matter to the public, or also like which of them when we try to convince or persuade people about the effects of global warming, which of them we shouldn't highlight as much as others.
That is really interesting. Do you see any big difference between Texans and respondents from other places? I mean, it's like in terms of those concerns, I mean, it's like an attitudes towards climate change. I mean, did any of those results surprise you at all?
No, I mean, in general, actually, it was very interesting to see how the results for Texas were very similar than those for the rest of the country, right? So, for example, there was a question about how worried were the respondents about climate change. And for the rest, let's say for Texas, 62% they were somewhat or very worried, right? And so 62%, and in the rest of the country, it was 65%. So, the difference is just marginal, but it truly represents what we see in other trends about like, beliefs of global warming, where they believe that climate changing is happening, is very similar what we see between Texas and the rest of the country.
This is really interesting because past surveys showed a divergence. I mean, Texas being so reliant on energy, I mean, it's like an energy sources as a source of employment, economic activity, and the like. I mean, it's like this convergence, I mean, it's like, is consistent with what we see in other issue areas as well. I mean, it's like, and also the generational divide, right? Younger people being more concerned about climate change in Texas and around the nation. That to me is a very important issue that we'll probably need to circle back towards the end of the presentation, because we're trying to send a message, I mean, it's like to the public, but also to policymakers about the importance of creating sustainable energy and being able to afford it. I mean, which is a discussion that will come later on. So these are, I was surprised also by that level of convergence, an interesting result. One of the issues that comes up in these types of surveys when we talked about some technical terms and technical policies and the like is whether the public understands what we're talking about. And so do we know that they internalize, I mean, it's like that the policies that we are offering them or the new techniques and the like are something that they are able to grasp. I mean, and I know, Gail, you've been looking at that part of the survey in terms of knowledge and attitudes, I mean, it's like, and how knowledge and attitudes relate. So do you want to share with our audience about those results?
Sure. I think we have a couple of slides to show to make it easier. But one of the questions we asked survey respondents was, have you read or heard about any of the following terms? So we asked them about carbon tax, carbon management, cap and trade, emissions trading systems, and so on, some of these other carbon mitigation policies. By far, the most recognized term was carbon tax. But overall, I'm not sure if the audience is able to see the numbers, but less than 50% recognized all of the other terms, carbon management, cap and trade, and the least recognized was carbon dividends, where only about 24% of respondents said they had either heard or read about these terms. We also asked, I think yes, perfect. We also asked respondents, whether fracking and flailing is good or bad for the environment, and we found sort of mixed results on sort of level of awareness about the impacts certain technologies have on the impact. So for fracking has a negative impact on the environment, the correct answer was true. And we saw about 60% of Texans, and 64% of those respondents in other US states get that correct. And we see a slightly higher percentage of respondents correctly answering flaring is good for the environment. So about 70% in both the US and in Texas answered that correctly. But overall, we found low recognition of some of the key policies that are being discussed, despite, awareness about what is some of the impacts of energy policy.
So what do we make of this awareness? And it's like, what's your read on these results? Do we also find differences across age groups and gender and education, and does that inform at all the way we approach these issues, right? So people are concerned about climate change. We're talking about policies for addressing our carbon footprint when it comes to energy, fuel, and electricity, and so on, or use of natural gas. So can you elaborate on any of that? Does the survey speak about these issues?
Sure. If we want to go back one slide to the terms that respondents, perfect. The sort of on average, we did find that respondents' level of awareness increased with education. So, for example, the cap and trade, that was highest among those with a post-graduate degree. But in terms of age, we had one figure in the report that showed that it was carbon tax, which was by far the most recognized term, was highest among those 65 and older, but we don't really see clean relationships between knowledge about these policies and age. So for example, carbon tax was slightly higher amongst those 65 and older. Similarly, cap and trade, that was most recognized by people older, in some of the older age groups, like older than 45, but carbon pricing, that had the highest levels of recognition amongst younger age groups, so 18 to 44. So those under 45 actually had higher recognition than the older age groups. So, that might be a function of what, sort of when these terms are used more often and in the news, or in terms of which ones are more salient for the for both carbon management, but then also for energy companies themselves. So we didn't see that clean relationship where older age groups had more knowledge and younger less. It varied by the specific term.
So the one interesting result that comes out from the report is the connection between awareness and knowledge that may create a space for policymakers and those interested in addressing decarbonization in terms of on the consumer side, requires some form of activity for educating the public. And I recall that we have discussed this earlier about this link between awareness and knowledge, and what we can make of those. Would you care to elaborate about that?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you said, that there's definitely a space for policymakers, for energy companies, for energy leaders, for advocacy groups to have more concentrated efforts in educating the public on these various policies. Without respondents having, heard or read about any of these terms, it's, we can't get a good baseline of whether or not they would support these enacting these policies at any level of government. So I think it's an important opportunity to educate the public about what are the possibilities for carbon mitigation and carbon management that can be used going forward.
So this also connects to another of the important findings in the report, but also one of the biggest hurdles for enacting these policies or changing business practices is that decarbonization, reducing our carbon footprint and the like, results in higher costs. And, those costs are associated with developing the technologies, right? But also it's like enacting, making consumers and firms internalize the cost of their activities. And it's like, and so one of the issues that we discuss, and it's my turn to present some of the results, is the idea that whether respondents are able to identify those costs and whether or not they're willing to pay for them. I mean, it's like, so we did find across the board. I mean, it's like, and then I'm going to go back again to some of the other issues that you were raising. We did ask respondents to express whether they would be willing to pay higher prices at the pump for fuel that was carbon neutral, or they were willing to pay higher costs in their electricity bill for renewables or for sources of energy that internalize the cost of decarbonization. And so the interesting part to me in these results is that there were pretty much no difference between Texans and residents. Texans who depend on energy more than other areas of the country. There were no big differences in terms of their willingness, expressed willingness to pay for those extra costs. And in fact, in some areas, Texans were more willing to pay for renewable sources of electricity, for instance, right? I mean, or higher prices at the pump. Again, this might be a result of their usage of these types of energy in comparison to other areas, but it was a very interesting result that aligned with concerns and the like that we talked before. But we went further than that, and we analyzed 4 different scenarios that, according to industry and other associations, would result in a reduction on the carbon footprint of consuming fuel or electricity from different sources, and ask respondents to tell us whether they thought they would be able to afford, or they would be interested in paying for this. For instance, we start in the first scenario. We ask respondents based on estimate from energy companies about what it would cost to have carbon neutral fuel. And that's the first graph to the left that we have here. And it suggests that a sizable number of respondents, I mean, it's like both in Texas and around the nation, close to 40%, thought that they could afford it. I mean, it's like 22%, give or take, thought it was expensive, that they could afford it. Roughly 13, 14% said that they are certain they can afford it. Another 7% said that they find it a good price. Now, 30% said they're not willing to engage in any of these activities, and then 27% said that it was expensive. I mean, they would not be able to afford it. And again, if we change the prices for other scenarios, another scenario we looked at is whether they would be willing to pay an increase in their monthly electricity prices to switch to renewables. Again, that price, the monthly price, was steeper, and this is based on average consumption by households around the US and the cost of producing energy from renewables. More than half could not afford it. 1 in 4 were not willing in buying, but another 4, were willing to entertain paying those extra costs, which is an interesting result in terms of, we know that at the right price, more and more people might be willing to pay to reduce the carbon footprint. We had 2 other scenarios, if we move to the next slide, that also suggest that depending on the price, people are willing to pay higher prices. For instance, we asked what it would, if they were willing to pay $5 extra to produce electricity from gas without flaring. And this is a very interesting result because Texans were overwhelmingly supportive of these scenario. I mean, and we're going to discuss. I think Ramanan, you have some ideas of what that means for for Texas and the rest of the nation. The rest of the nation were less willing, to pay, but still an overwhelming majority of them were. Now, the interesting part is that when we talk about an instrument like carbon tax, then, again, an overwhelming majority is willing to pay more. But the taxes don't wrap that well among Texans, right? Texans resist taxes more. So the instrument and the type of energy that we're talking about and so on affects respondents' willingness to pay. And this is an important, to me, an important lesson for policymakers and for consumers. And it's like to figure out what to make of this. And it's like, so I'd be very interested, Ramanan, in your interpretation of these results and what they mean for government and businesses. And then I want to circle back to Gail for another of her findings.
Yeah, this is really interesting data, right? In that venting and flaring are seen as substantial issues. The Texas legislature is considering, whether they need to intervene and mandate that flaring be banned. And clearly, Texans see it as a challenge. If we do ban flaring, do we lose natural gas completely as a source of energy? Clearly, it is a wonderful fuel for the energy transition. There are challenges with venting and flaring, and the Texans are basically are talking with their wallets by saying that they're willing to pay a little bit more to continue to use this resource of natural gas on a continuing basis. The nation, on the other hand, the rest of the nation, a little bit more different, right? They're perhaps thinking that we are pretty agnostic about the source of electricity. If it comes from wind, solar, geothermal, that's perfectly fine. I don't necessarily need to see this extra payment for stopping venting and flaring of natural gas when renewable energy sources such as wind and solar have become cost competitive. And they're cost competitive in sort of this artificial environment where they don't have to pay for the grid and the maintenance of the grid, et cetera, the extension of the grid. And so once that gets factored in, and that's where the second scenario comes in, where this $20 hike in bringing renewables, that starts to give you a different perspective that when you factor in all costs, then there is the sort of the universal drive towards renewables sort of starts to slow down, and natural gas starts to get much more competitive there. So I really feel like this speaks to a very sophisticated Texan consumer that understands the whole value chain. That you produce the natural gas. If we focus on the emission side of it, which is what happens when you flare, you're wasting that resource, or you vent where you put this greenhouse gas, this really dominant greenhouse gas, methane into the environment. They really understand the challenges. The environmental challenges are not worth it. And so if we start to mitigate it, they understand there's a price and they're willing to pay. So I would say it's a very sophisticated consumer, somewhat at odds with the idea that that they are not as knowledgeable with the carbon mitigation strategies such as carbon taxes or cap and trade or emission trading systems. But when you cut it down and break it into real terms that really impact their wallet, they're pretty sophisticated. So Gail, I know you have some thoughts on that one.
Yes, I think in discussing what we were earlier about education and age, we also see some differences by gender. Generally, women were slightly more likely to believe in climate change, slightly more likely to believe in that it's caused by human activities and so on. But even with willingness to pay, there were some differences. Women in particular were much more likely to be amenable to paying higher prices for carbon neutral fuel. So they on average, or their average was much higher for carbon neutral fuel and also for natural gas based electricity as opposed to men. So they also reported willing to pay more on month per, again, on the average than men were.
The willingness to pay story is really interesting in terms of this disaggregation, but also in terms of how consumers, which is basically, I mean, responders for us are mostly consumers rather than employees of oil and gas and the like, how they blame different actors, like for the carbon footprint of their activities. And I believe we have a slide about that. I mean, it's like, Yewande,
oh, yes, sorry. You asked about that before. The I think we have the responsibility slide.
Yes, because it speaks very, I mean, it's like nice in terms of what would it take. It's like to develop those policies that would result in sustainable energy, right?
So as we've mentioned before, the sort of highest, I guess, respondents were more likely to attribute responsibility to the oil and gas industry, as well as governments of developed countries, and then the lowest level of responsibility was attributed to individual consumption and behavior, despite it having a big impact. But then when we looked at how respondents attributed responsibility by their level of knowledge, using those two questions we showed previously, we see a little bit of a different story, that with some knowledge about policies and impacts of energy practices on the environment, respondents were much more likely to attribute responsibility to themselves, to individual consumption and behavior as well, again, and then we see the same trends about the attributing responsibility to oil and gas, governments of developed countries, followed by the other industries like transportation, coal, and meat and dairy. And so, as Pablo said, there is a real opportunity to educate consumers and the public at large about the varying impacts of industry, what they can do to mitigate climate change, what they themselves can do to mitigate climate change, and what governments can do.
I want to bring in Ramanan and Aparajita to this discussion right away. You have done extensive work on the oil and gas sector in Texas, and we spoke earlier about the potential impact of the survey and our findings for policymaking. But what would be to you the take-home points for industry? I mean, it's like both. I mean, on the side of employers, but also employees. And I know that you have some, I mean, it's like interesting ideas to discuss on that account.
So I'll start this, and then Aparajita can jump in as you think appropriate. And I think for the major oil companies, this issue, and this slide really addresses it, right? It comes back to the oil and gas industry being the dominant player that is responsible for climate change. Is something that people have, people across the country, even in Texas, have attributed it to. And part of how the oil and gas industry has responded has been, they have said that they're going to move towards a net zero plan for some time into the future. But have tried to address this by talking about, say, carbon tax, carbon pricing. And a lot of those, the public agenda has really focused on talking about how they want to equal the playing field and really talk about it in terms of carbon pricing, carbon tax within this country. And clearly, this survey that we've seen here, that message is not getting through to the common public, right? They're not necessarily seeing that as a method to address the issue of climate change and the anthropogenic nature of climate change, and who's responsible for the anthropogenic nature of climate change. So that's going to be a huge area where I think the industry needs to focus. And I know Aparajita has some ideas about this. I'll come back to that in a minute. About 4 other points that I think that are important to make about where the industry can sort of respond. One is the issue, if you start to focus on the emissions and this issue of carbon emissions, There is bipartisan support that our survey found that says that this must be addressed. It is a good thing to address it through carbon management. If you do it and you get revenues that come into the carbon management side of it, by addressing it, it should go towards research and development that should really address how do we minimize the impact of the emissions. So that clearly very positive thing there that I think the oil and gas can take and run with. Second one is that venting and flaring are on people's minds. And there will be addressing of this that will happen. It is perhaps, it behooves the industry to be proactive about this and address it before there's strong regulatory pressure of banning natural gas or banning the issue of how we transport natural gas. The third one is that renewable energy is real. People are willing to look at it as an alternate. They're willing to put in reasonable amounts of money into transitioning to renewable energy. And so embracing it as a methodology for advancing the energy transition is something that the oil and gas industry should look at and should advance. Rather than seeing it as a competition, seeing it as something that could be integrated into hard to decarbonize areas is going to be places where I think they can really advance their own agenda, but also the agenda of society. And the fourth point, and I think this really comes back to the first issue that we were talking about, which is how do you make sure you have the public that is educated? And so this comes back to really significant efforts, I think, that they must undertake to address the issue of education and workforce development. Especially, this pandemic has laid bare some of the biggest challenges that the industry faces today, which is not only are oil prices depressed, the public and society is putting pressure on them on the carbon side of it, on carbon management, wanting to see how you mitigate emissions. But perhaps the biggest one is the loss of talent from the industry. And the talent isn't just walking away because they don't necessarily see this as a viable, economically accessible area where the job growth won't be there. There will be job growth. But more importantly, the talent is walking away, especially the younger talent is walking away because they don't see the changes happening in the energy side toward as they make the promises of an energy transition, the pathways to an energy transition. The younger generation is not seeing a fast enough progress here. And I think trying to accelerate that progress, trying to find ways to not just talk about it as research and development, but truly commercial deployment of carbon management, of energy transition is something that I think the public and their own employees see as a really important part of where they move forward. Aparajita, I know you had a bunch of thoughts on this. I want to yield it to you and have you talk about it.
So one of the interesting results we found was that despite the slowdown and despite the fact that we're seeing younger people move away from the oil and gas industry, people think that the greatest job growth in the next 10 years would be in carbon management and in the oil and gas industry. So if the industry invests in technologies for carbon management, they will be taking care of the emissions, but they may not have the workforce, like Dr. Krishnamoorti mentioned. You need to have a ready workforce to take on that challenge. And that's probably a good opportunity for the industry to partner with academic institutions, make sure that they are training their future workforce right, and investing beyond technology, firstly. And another result that really spoke out to me was public education, like we've discussed, seems to be lacking, but there are three clear accounts on which this seems to be lacking. Firstly, definitely the policy instruments for carbon management. The public seems, fairly familiar with carbon tax, but at the same time, globally deployed solutions like emissions trading systems, ETS, which has been prevalent in Europe for a while. The US doesn't seem to have that sort of awareness. And on the second thing that the public seems to lack awareness on is that this is not a distant threat. We are seeing the impacts today. And this is not a problem that we can, wait to address, or this is something that the future generations will have to deal with. We have to deal with it today, and the public education or awareness programs, climate communications programs have to be aligned with that. And the third thing is that, looking at some of the willingness to pay information and how respondents express, or what respondents expressed in those, it seems like there is a lack of understanding as to what the transitions and the timelines for those transitions look like, what different mitigation opportunities could offer. And even though there's a higher cost to renewables, it seems like there's more inclination towards that, but that could take a longer time. So the public would probably benefit from education on that, understanding what their options are, and then making an informed decision.
This is, to me, a natural point to push into something that came in the survey over and over, and it shows in other surveys, which is this intergenerational divide. I mean, it's like the threat of climate change. I mean, it's like for older folks doesn't seem to be immediate, or for the self. I mean, as Yewande showed us early on, does not seem to be. I mean, it's like such a big concern, but it is for future generations. So. Francisco, I know you have some thoughts about this intergenerational divide, and it's like and the difference across the generation. And I would like to poke you and ask you if you think that this may have implications for the future of sustainable energy policy. And it's like and the options that legislators and policymakers may have. And it's like in terms of balancing the demand from different groups of voters, and it's like in terms of their generational differences and preferences.
Yes, I think it is because I guess as younger generations get the right to vote and participate in the political process, I guess all this debate about climate policies or the existence of global warming is no longer going to be an issue, right? And I guess the clearest example, and related to what Ramanan, Aparajita, Gail were talking about, is the beliefs on climate change, or whether climate change is happening, which was the first result that Yewande presented. I guess if you ask among the group between 18 and 44 years old, the average, or the share of people who believe that climate change is happening is 86%. Now, if you move to the group of those with 65 years old and older, it's only 75%. So there is this gap of 10 points, which marks these differences across generations.
So Houston and Texas, I mean, it's like at the heart of the energy industry in the world, and it's like and climate change is not a localized issue, and it's like and I know that some members of these panels have been thinking about this issue globally. Yewande, you had some ideas about the role of international development and organizations and maybe global businesses on this, but it might be interesting to talk about this process, and later on I'll ask the panelists to think about how this connects to the change in administration that's coming at the federal level in the U.S. and what implications it may have. I mean, it's like for enacting policies that will result in decarbonization, while I mean, it's like for us as Texans sustaining the energy sector as a vibrant sector of the economy. Aparajita, you want to talk about international, development organizations? Sorry, Yewande.
Yeah, yeah. So, so what we've realized during this COVID is that carbon management and reducing pollution is very, very important. And international development organizations such as the World Bank, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization are already thinking about this. And I think that joining the Paris Agreement is going to facilitate that conversation, because there is need for coordination and cooperation of all countries to be able to have this conversation, particularly with China, so that each country is willing and ready to pay their fair share for the world to achieve a sustainable energy. So, so my thought is that the first step towards that conversation happening is joining the Paris Agreement. And I'm happy that President Biden is already showing a green light in that direction. The WTO and the World Bank is already having a conversation to bring developed countries together so that they can start this conversation on addressing carbon management. And I believe once the coordination and is addressed, it will be on a path to having a great conversation whereby each country pays their fair share.
So what do you think? I mean, it's like in general. I mean, it's like anybody on the panel, feel free talk about are the biggest opportunities for Texas and the upcoming legislature in terms of what we could do with some of the issues that are highly relevant for our fellow Texans, including issues of balancing the need to sustain the energy sector with reducing our carbon footprint, but including reducing flaring, right, and venting on natural gas, the cost that might be incurred to prevent that. I mean, it's like, and how to make it sustainable.
So I can jump in there very quickly.
Sure.
I think the first and foremost, I think one of the things that we heard very clearly and loudly from the survey was climate change is something that the public wants to see addressed, and it's real. It needs to be addressed, and perhaps the lowest hanging fruit for the state legislature to consider is a carbon management solution. Really find ways to encourage the deployment of carbon emission technologies, reducing carbon emissions. The second one, I think, in terms of what we saw was about flaring and venting. This is front and center in the minds of the Texas legislature. It has got certainly resonance with the public at large in the state of Texas. The third one, and this is a little bit different than what we've talked about up to this point, is about the issue of pipelines. Pipelines have been something that for a long time, we've had eminent domain sort of trump over everything else and been left to that. Over the last couple legislative cycles, this issue of eminent domain has come up as being something that could be challenged. And the legislature did not act on it last time. There's been renewed action on that. People want to see more action in that. And the pipeline companies have sort of started to act on it by canceling a lot of the pipeline projects that they were working on. What we are hearing from this survey is that perhaps with the lack of support for opposing pipeline development, in fact, more people were either supportive or did not have an opinion than opposed the idea of pipelines, both in Texas, but also nationally. This might be an issue where if there is a common carrier, the common good of the people, then there is an advantage to do this and do it right. And especially when you combine it with this issue of flaring, leaking, venting, where if we can find ways to mitigate that, put in technologies to mitigate it, put in policies that start to apply significant penalties for venting and flaring, I think this pipeline issue and the issue of eminent domain perhaps needs to get pushed back from the Texas legislature.
You raised a very important issue early on, which is connected to this, right? So flaring and venting of natural gas are a consequence of development of the Permian Basin. And it's like, and so the gas is at a place where it cannot be developed into feedstock and other issues because it's costly, and developing infrastructure for that is also a cost. And it's like, but then this hits back into, I mean, it's like, especially in Texas, to this idea that some instruments are more likely to be tolerated by Texan voters and others are not, right? So we might think that for instance, right, banning flaring and venting, I mean, it's like, does not seem to imply a cost because it's not a tax. I mean, it's like, but if we start thinking about the cost of taxing some activities to force consumers and producers to internalize, the cost of their behavior, and it's like the externalities from their behavior, then it becomes more problematic, especially in Texas, right? So the idea here is like circling back to something that we talked about before, the role of the policy makers and public opinion, and particularly those who are interested in making these lower or decarbonized economy of the future a reality, is in the area of educating the public, and it's like into what the cost of action and inaction might mean, and it's like and I think we got at something with the willingness to pay question, but as we saw, there's a lot of room for improvement here in terms of knowledge and understanding, and also, I mean, it's like making people internalize that, I mean, the cost of free ridings are gonna come to haunt us. Right? It's like, and that to me is a big challenge, right? How do we align this issue of concerns and support for policies that aim at mitigating climate change with the willingness to endure extra cost for attaining those outcomes? And I think that's an area that where we might want to focus in terms of creating politically feasible solutions. And I understand, I mean, that was our hope when we started this project. I mean, it's like that to help illuminate those debates about the future of energy in Texas and also the future of our environment. Is there any way that we can square this circle? Right? It's like how we bring together this idea of high concerns about what the future may bring and the individual costs that may result into those. I mean, it's like, do you have any ideas on what would be the path forward that would help us there? And it's like, Ramanan, you talk about low-hanging fruits. Anybody else, I mean, can think of any in that dimension?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in on this. I think any government policy that would encourage businesses to practice this carbon management or to support carbon management, it has to be, that policy has to address the business models that these businesses run with. Businesses want to profit, and whatever policy that's out there that doesn't make them profitable, it's not going to be attractive to them. So any policy towards carbon management must address that first. And I also think that if these policies can be tied to their corporate social responsibility, not just about doing business, but how they make the life of all their consumers better, because this is where we live in. We want to have a cleaner environment. So if they can tie this to corporate social responsibility, and I think that will make it attractive, and that could also promote and make them engage in this sustainable energy path. Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So I think another interesting result was that, and this has not been recorded in past surveys, that the public is willing to pay for a price on carbon that is not revenue neutral. They don't want the revenue to be returned to them as rebates, but they would rather have it invested in energy and environment R&D. I think this is a great opportunity for policymakers and for the industry to come together with educators. Of course, my bias from academia plays in here, but I think academic institutions have a role to play here. And if we have to address the public education aspect of this, then everybody has to collaborate. Can't stress enough on how important education is.
It's interesting connecting the last two responses, right? Yeah, one is on Aparajita's, because industry might be painting themselves into a corner in this issue, right? It's like, and Ramanan, you raised an excellent point before. It's like, so we have stakeholders and people interested in climate change that are creating higher costs, I mean, for business as usual practices. I mean, it's like what we call social licensing. And if that results, I mean, it's like in a higher regulation of the energy sector, then the energy will be forced to incur in those costs. I mean, it's like, or go out of business altogether. So these things that we observe that consumers, respondents, potential voters are willing to entertain higher taxes on themselves to help reduce the cost of the transition through encouraging research and development and exploration and implementation of the new technologies, or development new technologies, then we might find a potential solution that's acceptable both to businesses, voters, and policymakers. So I think that might be an area where we can align these incentives, right? So. Do we have any, closing thoughts? We're reaching the end of our time, and it's like allotted for this presentation. And in addition to asking our audience to read our report, it's like send us feedback. We're hoping to keep doing this, especially, for the next legislative session and into the future. That's the role we see. It's like, at Energy and the Harvard School, informing those policy debates. But I would like to go around the table, it's like and gather collect your closing thoughts on what we've done today and what we've done with the report. Who wants to start? Ramanan, you want to take the lead?
Well, I was going to reflect on what Gail and Francisco had said. I thought these were two really important points that they made. One was that there is a gender difference that is substantial when it comes to looking at climate-related issues and how do we mitigate those. And I think that there is a take-home message there that perhaps we need to expand further. And the second one that Francisco brought up, which was the intergenerational divide, I think is a really, really important point that starts to address a lot of what we should be thinking about, which is the current generation is not willing to accept the status quo, and addressing what they see as being accretive is going to be important for the overall economy. And I think those were two huge messages that perhaps get lost in sort of the shuffle that we've talked about in terms of government policies, as well as what the oil industry should do. These are two perhaps messages that we should really find ways to amplify and really explore further.
Yes, I agree with Ramanan there in that, we've seen intergenerational differences in other areas as well, but it's particularly stark here that, the millennial generation and the younger generations, as they grow older, this is going to be and become more, I guess, as you could say, reliable voters and voters that regularly turn out to vote. It's going to be increasingly important for policymakers to heed the concerns of younger generations.
I think another interesting point, and talking on what Ramanan was mentioning, is like, now we found these trends, and we know that there is kind of I won't say like a consensus, but a great majority who have this beliefs on climate change and this willingness to pay. And now it's like, what would be the best way to convince them, right? Like how can we persuade them in the best way? And I think that's the next step, right? It's not only like what they believe, but now how can we change their attitudes? And I guess that's the new challenge.
So creating a new coalition that supports the policies that would help us get, where we need to be. Yewande, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think what the survey finding shows is that people generally are aware about climate change. They are willing to support carbon management, even though the willingness is different across generation and across gender, but that is good. But like I said earlier on, global coordination is important. Climate change is a global problem, and we need the cooperation of other countries to be able to reach that goal. And the policymaker have to consider that in whatever policy direction we intend to follow.
Aparajita?
I think the fact that it's a global challenge gives us a very big local opportunity. Texas, has determined the outcomes for the energy industry over the last few decades. And I think this can serve, considering that public opinion in Texas resembles the rest of the nation. I think this can serve as an opportunity for the legislators to actually take action and see what works here. And that could have a positive spillover in other states as well.
This is great, and this is what we intended to do when we launched this project. I mean, early in the year before the pandemic hit all of us. I'm glad we pulled it off. I mean, it was a pleasure working with this team, and this team will keep working. You'll see more reports, memos, and even academic papers coming out of this research and the future to come. It was a pleasure. I mean, it's like, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the panelists and for everybody that made this happen. I mean, it's like the support we got from UH Energy and the Hobby School to release the report. I mean, it's like put out the webpage, and it's like UH Media Relations, especially Jeannie Keever, who's instrumental in helping us put the word out of what we're doing. And we're hoping to have an impact, and we'll keep trying. Happy holidays to all. I mean, it's like, I, for one, I'm glad that 2020 is going to be over soon. And I'm looking forward to see you all, it's like, in the next round. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.